Every stitch I made could mean my life or someone else's. I still feel the needle between my fingers even now, decades later, when my hands are gnarled and stiff with age. Not the cold steel of it, but the weight, the unbearable lightness of hope threaded through it. Back then, in that place where the sky never quite turned blue, I learned that a single thread could carry more than cloth. It could carry a name, a prayer, a date. Sometimes, if I was lucky, a whisper of tomorrow. My name is Clara Weiss. I was 23 when they took us from the ghetto in Łódź. The snow that morning wasn't falling. It hung in the air, suspended, as if even the sky couldn't bear to let it land. My mother held my youngest brother's coat closed with one hand, the other gripping mine like it was the last anchor to a world already sinking. We didn't cry. We had learned early that tears were luxuries. Instead, we walked. Past the barbed wire, past the guards who didn't look us in the eye, past the silence that wasn't silence at all. It was a hum, low and constant, like the earth itself was holding its breath. They separated us on the ramp. Not with shouts or force, but with glances. A flick of the wrist, a tilt of the chin. My mother went left, my brother right. I stood there numb until a woman in a striped dress pulled me toward the tailor's barracks. "You sew?" she asked, her voice rough as burlap. I nodded. My mother had taught me before the war in our little flat above the bakery, where the scent of rye bread used to seep through the floorboards. "Good," she said, "then you might live another day." The barracks smelled of damp wool, sour sweat, and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or the ghost of it. Sunlight barely pierced the grimy windows, casting long gray shadows over the rows of women bent over machines or hand-stitching collars. We worked in silence, save for the occasional cough or the soft click of scissors. No music, no chatter, only the rhythmic pulse of needles piercing fabric, tiny, desperate heartbeats. I was assigned to the officers' uniforms. Crisp gray wool, silver buttons, perfect creases. Irony doesn't wear a uniform, but if it did, it would look like that. I stitched for men who ordered death with the same hands that adjusted their lapels before dinner. I measured their shoulders, pinned their cuffs, and each time I did, I felt the fabric grow heavier. Not with thread, but with guilt, with shame, with rage so quiet it threatened to drown me. But then I noticed something small, almost invisible. A woman named Miriam, older than the rest of us, with eyes like cracked porcelain, would slip a folded slip of paper into the lining of her coat she'd just finished. Not every coat, only the ones bound for the outer administration office. At first I thought it madness, but the next week Miriam was still there. And the week after that, she never spoke to me, but one evening, as we stacked finished garments by the door, she brushed against my arm and whispered, "The thread must be strong, but the knot must be loose." That night, I couldn't sleep. The words looped in my mind like a reel gone slack. In the morning, I tucked a tiny square of paper, scrawled with my brother's name and birth date, into the hem of a tunic. My hands shook so badly I pricked my finger twice, but I did it, and something changed in me then. Not courage, I wouldn't call it that. More like purpose, stitched tightly into my ribs. I began to listen differently, not just to orders, but to silences, to footsteps outside the barracks, to the rhythm of roll calls. I learned which guards turned away when handing over uniforms. Which overseer had a wife who sent him cakes in waxed paper. He always left the boxes behind, and I'd find them hours later, damp with grease and possibility. I used the paper to write names, dates, messages that meant nothing to anyone but us. Leah, born 1928, remembers lilacs. Yakov survived the typhus in Block 12. Simple things. Human things. We never knew if the notes reached anyone beyond the wire, but we sewed them anyway. Because hope isn't about certainty, it's about defiance. It's about saying, even in the smallest stitch, I was here. We were real. Winter deepened, the air grew sharp enough to cut your lungs, food became scarcer and sleep thinner. Yet in that cold, we found warmth, not in blankets, but in secrets passed hand to hand like sacraments. A button with a name etched in pencil underneath. A cuff with extra thread looped in Morse-like patterns only we understood. We built a language of cloth and care, invisible to those who saw us only as ghosts in gray. One morning, Miriam didn't come to work. Her machine sat empty, the scissors neatly folded beside it. No explanation, just absence. I kept sewing. But that day, I sewed my own name into the breast pocket of an officer's winter coat. Clara Weiss, Woods, 1920. Not as a plea, as a declaration. They never found the messages. Or if they did, they didn't understand them. To them, it was just fabric, but to us, it was memory. It was resistance, it was love, stitched into the lining of a world trying to erase us. Sometimes, when I close my eyes now, I hear the soft whir of the sewing machine, the sigh of fabric unfurling, the quiet click of the needle finding its place. And in that sound, I hear them, all of them, still breathing, still speaking, through every thread I dared to leave behind. Because every stitch I made could mean my life, or someone else's. And I chose to stitch for both.
The cold never left us, not really. Even in summer, it clung to the bones. A damp ghost that whispered through the cracks in the walls and settled in the hollows between ribs. But by spring something shifted. Not in the sky, God knew, that stayed its usual shade of ash, but in us. In the way we held our needles, in the way we looked at each other without flinching. There was a quiet understanding now, a kind of silent pact woven into every hem we turned and every seam we pressed flat with trembling hands. We were no longer just stitching uniforms. We were stitching time, stitching truth, stitching each other into the world, one hidden letter at a time. I began to notice the rhythms of the camp as if they were patterns on a dressmaker's dummy. The guards changed shifts at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., always the same two men, Kraus, with his limp and sour breath, and Hoffman, younger, eyes darting like a spooked bird. Hoffman never looked directly at us. He'd hand over a bundle of tunics, drop them on the workbench as if they might burn him, and vanish before we could meet his gaze. Krause, on the other hand, liked to linger. He'd run a finger along a newly pressed seam, mutter something about his wife's taste in coats, then leave with a sigh that sounded almost human. You learned to read them like fabric, grain, tension, wear, and you learned to work within their folds. My hands grew steadier, or perhaps it was my heart that finally stopped shaking. I started using finer thread for the messages, white on white, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I'd tuck a name into the inner collar, a date along the side seam, a single Hebrew letter embroidered inside a buttonhole. Tiny acts of witness, tiny acts of war. I never wrote full sentences. Too dangerous. Just fragments, a name, a village, a mother's prayer. Enough to say this person existed. Enough to say don't let them disappear. One afternoon, a new girl arrived, maybe 16, hair shorn unevenly, eyes wide as saucers. She stood in the doorway of the barracks, swaying slightly, clutching a bundle of grey cloth like it might shield her. No one spoke. We never did, not at first. But I saw the tremor in her fingers, the way she kept glancing at the sewing machines as if they might bite. So I stood, walked over, and took the bundle from her. "Sit," I said, placing her gently on the bench beside mine. "You know how to thread a needle?" She nodded barely. "Good. Start here." I handed her a half-finished tunic and a spool of black thread. Then quietly, I slipped a small square of paper into the lining pocket already stitched into the garment. Esther Minsk, 1927. Her name. Her origin. Her first stitch in our silent rebellion. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. But that night, as we lay on our wooden slats, she turned her face toward the wall and whispered, so softly I almost missed it. My mother used to sing while she sewed. I didn't answer, but I hummed just once, a lullaby my own mother used to sing. Still die Nacht ist ausgestern, as quietly as breath. And in that moment, the barracks didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a room full of women remembering. The work grew heavier, not in weight but in meaning. Every uniform that left our hands carried something, sometimes a name, sometimes a date, sometimes just a single dot of ink that meant alive. We didn't know who received them or if anyone ever found the messages, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the act itself, the choice, the refusal to let the silence win. Then came the day the transport list appeared. It was pinned to the bulletin board like a theatre poster. Names in neat script. Block numbers. Departure time 040. No destination. None of us needed to ask. We knew what 040 meant. Knew it by the way the air thickened the night before. By the way the guards avoided eye contact. By the sudden absence of certain faces at roll call. Esther's name was on it. I saw her standing before the board, arms wrapped around herself, lips moving silently. I didn't go to her, not then, not in front of everyone. But that night, during the hour between lights out and the guards' final rounds, I crept to her bunk. She was awake. She must have known I'd come. I held out a small piece of lining fabric, already stitched into a pouch. Inside, a button, a thread of blue, her favorite color she'd mentioned once, and 2 words in pencil. You mattered. She took it, pressed it to her chest, and nodded. No tears, just that nod, grave and full of a dignity no uniform could strip away. At dawn, they loaded the transport. I watched from the window, my breath fogging the glass. Esther walked straight-backed, her head high. In her coat pocket, my coat, the one I'd altered for her just days before, was that little pouch sewn so deep into the lining it would take a surgeon to find it. And in that pocket, her truth. After they left, the silence in the barracks was different, thicker, grieving, but not broken. We returned to our machines, to our needles, to our quiet work of memory, because stopping would have been surrender. And we had already decided we would not disappear without a trace. That week I began a new practice. I kept a tiny ledger, just scraps of paper bound with thread, hidden beneath my mattress. Names, dates, messages sent. Faces I refused to forget. I wrote them in the dark, by the faint glow of a smuggled candle stub, my fingers smudged with soot and ink. Miriam, gone March 12th, remember her laugh, it sounded like bells. Esther, Minsk, took the blue thread with her. My brother Daniel, last seen block 14, still breathing I pray. Writing them down made them real, made us real. One evening, as I sewed a captain's insignia onto a fresh tunic, I felt a presence beside me. It was Rivka, the woman who'd first pulled me into the barracks. She placed a folded note on my lap without a word. I opened it later under my blanket. Just 2 lines. The next transport goes to Berlin. The coats go with them. Use the double seam, my breath caught. Berlin, a city, not a smokestack. A chance, however slim, that someone somewhere might find what we'd hidden. That night, I didn't sleep. I stitched until my fingers bled, weaving names into every double seam I could manage. Leah, Yakov, Daniel, Esther. I used the finest thread, the tiniest knots. I made each stitch a promise, a prayer, a refusal, and when the uniforms were collected the next morning, I watched the cart roll away, heart pounding not with fear, but with something close to hope. Because hope, I'd learned, doesn't roar, it whispers. It hides in hems, it travels in coats, and sometimes, just sometimes, it reaches the other side. Summer came, though it felt more like a trick of the light than a true season. The sun rose earlier, lingered longer, and baked the mud between the barracks into cracked tiles of dust. Heat pressed down on us like a heavy blanket, making the air thick and sluggish. Even the guards seemed slower, their boots heavier, their voices less sharp. But in that lethargy, we found cracks, tiny, fleeting openings where breath could slip through. I began to notice changes in the camp itself. Fewer transports arrived. The roll calls grew shorter, the shouts less frequent. Rumors moved like moths in the dark. Whispers of advancing armies, of radio broadcasts crackling through hidden receivers, of officers burning papers in oil drums behind the commandant's quarters. No one dared believe them outright. Hope was a dangerous luxury, after all. But we held them close, these rumors, like spare buttons kept in a pocket, useless until the moment they weren't. My hands, once raw and split, had calloused over. The needle no longer felt foreign. It was an extension of my will. I'd perfected the art of the double seam, a technique my mother had taught me for winter coats back in Łódź. 2 lines of stitching, nearly identical, with a whisper-thin channel between them. Perfect for hiding paper, perfect for smuggling truth. I'd taught it to 3 others now. Rivka, of course, and 2 younger girls, Ilana and Miri, who moved like shadows but watched everything. They learned quickly, too quickly perhaps, for girls so young to carry such weight. But what choice did we have? Survival wasn't just about breath. It was about bearing witness. One sweltering afternoon, a new order came down. We were to prepare winter uniforms ahead of schedule. Wool tunics, lined jackets, even gloves. It made no sense. The war couldn't last that long, could it? But orders were orders. And in that absurd task, I saw an opportunity. Wool was thick, dense, forgiving. Linings could be layered, pockets reinforced, seams deepened. I worked with a quiet urgency, folding messages not just into cuffs and collars, but into elbow patches, into the interior bands of hats, into the very cuffs of gloves. Tiny scrolls tucked between layers, sealed with beeswax scraped from ration tins. Ilana, slight and quick-fingered, developed a system. She'd stitch a single red thread, scavenged from a discarded officer's sash, into the top buttonhole of any garment containing a message. Just one thread, barely visible, but we knew. And if anyone ever found the code, they'd know too. I thought often of Daniel. My brother. The last time I'd seen him was during a roll call months ago. Thin, pale, but standing. He'd caught my eye for a fraction of a second and given the tiniest nod. That nod lived inside me now, warm and stubborn. I wrote his name into every 3rd coat. Daniel Weiss, born 1932, loves chess, knows 3 Yiddish songs by heart. If the world forgot him, it wouldn't be for lack of my trying. Then came the rain, not gentle summer rain, but a torrent that turned paths to rivers and soaked through roofs. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooled on the floor, soaked the bottom layers of fabric stacked near the walls. Panic flared, ruined uniforms meant punishment. But Rivka, ever practical, dragged the stacks onto raised platforms made of broken crates. "Let it rain," she muttered. "The sky's crying for us. Might as well make use of it." And in that downpour, something unexpected happened. A junior clerk, a boy barely older than Daniel, came to collect a batch of coats. He slipped on the wet floor, dropped the bundle, and cursed under his breath. As he scrambled to gather them, his sleeve rode up, revealing a faded bruise. Our eyes met, just for a second. But in that glance, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Shame. Not cruelty, not indifference, shame. Later that night, I found a small envelope tucked beneath my sewing machine. No name, just a single sentence in smudged ink. "I'll check the linings in Berlin." I promise I didn't sleep, not because I doubted him, but because I dared to believe. From then on, the messages grew bolder. Not in content, never that, but in placement. We stitched coordinates into belt loops, the location of mass graves, drawn from whispered accounts. We wove dates of arrivals into sleeve hems. We pressed tiny drawings, a bird, a lily, a child's hand, into the inner flaps of jacket pockets. Symbols of what we'd lost, symbols of what we still carried. The guards didn't notice. How could they? To them, we were machines. Hands without hearts. But we weren't stitching for them. We were stitching for the future. For the day, someone would unfold a coat found in an attic or a museum or a flea market and wonder, who made this? Who wore it? Who hid their soul inside it? One evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Miri showed me something she'd been working on. A child's dress, no bigger than a doll's, stitched from scraps of grey lining and a shred of faded blue gingham someone had smuggled in. "Forester's little sister," she whispered. "If she's still out there." The dress had no message. It didn't need one. Its existence was the message. I held it in my hands, feeling the softness of the gingham against my palm. It smelled faintly of lavender. Someone must have rubbed soap on it, trying to disguise its origin. or perhaps to give it back a scent of home. That night, I dreamed of my mother's sewing room, sunlight on the wooden floor, the hum of her pedal machine, the smell of fresh bread drifting up from the bakery below. In the dream, she handed me a spool of golden thread. "Use it wisely," she said. "It's all we have left." I woke with tears drying on my cheeks and the taste of rye bread in my mouth. The next morning, a new transport list appeared. Shorter this time, only 15 names. Mine wasn't on it. But Rivka's was. We didn't speak of it. We never did. But that afternoon, as we worked side by side, she passed me a folded square of paper. Inside, a tiny embroidered star, 6-pointed, stitched in silver thread so fine it shimmered. "For your ledger," she said quietly. "So you remember us not just by names, but by light." At dawn, she walked to the transport line with her head high, her posture straight, her hands empty, but her coat lined with 100 whispered goodbyes. After she left, I sat at my machine longer than usual. The silence pressed in, but it didn't crush me. Instead, it filled me, with resolve, with sorrow, with love so deep it ached like a bruise. I picked up a half-finished officer's coat, turned it inside out, and began to stitch. Not a name this time, just one word hidden in the seam of the left sleeve, in thread so pale it vanished unless held to the light. Remember, because if no one else would, I would, and I'd make sure the world heard us, even if it took decades, even if it took a lifetime, even if all that remained was a single thread trembling in the wind saying, "We were here." Autumn arrived not with leaves. There were no trees near the barracks, but with a shift in the wind. It came from the east now, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of burnt wood and something else, something metallic like rust or distant thunder. The days grew shorter, the roll calls colder, and the officers more restless. Papers flew from offices at odd hours. Trucks rumbled in and out through the night, headlights cutting through the dark like blade flashes. Change was coming, not salvation. None of us were foolish enough to call it that, but motion. And in a place built on stillness, on erasure, even motion felt like grace. I kept stitching, always stitching. My fingers moved almost without thought now, guided by instinct, by memory, by the quiet chorus of names that lived inside me. Daniel, Esther, Rivka, Miriam, Leah, Yaakov, Ilana, Miri, each one a pulse in the fabric. Each one a reason to keep my back straight, my breath steady, my needle true. The coats kept going to Berlin. I never knew if the clerk kept his promise, but I chose to believe he did. Belief, I'd learned, wasn't about proof. It was about defiance. So I stitched as if someone was waiting, as if someone would care. Then, one grey morning, Ilana didn't come to work. She'd been coughing for days, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the barracks like a warning bell. We'd shared our meager rations, tucked extra blankets around her at night, whispered psalms when the guards weren't near. But fever took her fast. By dawn, she was gone, just like that. No transport, no list, just an empty bunk, and a silence so heavy it made the air feel thin. Miri and I wrapped her in a piece of unbleached muslin we'd saved for emergencies. No shroud, but the closest we could manage. We buried her name in a winter greatcoat that afternoon. Ilana Vilnius, 1925. Could mimic bird calls with her hands, stitched into the storm flap of the hood, where rain might wash it clean, but wind might carry it farther. That night, Miri sat beside me on the edge of my bunk. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at her hands, turning them over like she'd never seen them before. "They took my family in 42. She finally said, her voice so soft I had to lean in. My little brother Eli clung to my coat. They pried his fingers loose one by one. I still hear the sound he made. Not a cry, a whimper. Like a dog, she swallowed. I never told anyone. I thought if I said it out loud, it would make it real again. It's already real, I said. But saying it, that makes you real. She nodded, tears tracking clean lines down her grime-streaked cheeks. And then, quietly, she began to hum. A tune I didn't recognize, but that felt like lullabies and lost things and a home that no longer existed. I joined her, not with the melody, but with the silence around it. And in that shared breath, we weren't prisoners. We were sisters, daughters, keepers of the unspoken. After that, our work deepened. Not just names now, but stories. Tiny fragments, stitched like seeds into the earth of fabric. Eli, 5 years old, loved honey cakes. My father played violin on Shabbat. We had a cat named Mira who slept on the windowsill. Ordinary things, beautiful things. The kind of details that make a person more than a number. One afternoon, while altering a captain's dress uniform, I found something unexpected, a small tear near the epaulette, clumsily mended with uneven stitches. Someone had tried to fix it before it reached us. I unpicked the repair carefully, and beneath it, hidden in the fold of the lining, was a photograph, faded, damp but intact. A woman and a child standing by a garden gate. The woman smiled softly. The child held a daisy. My hands trembled. I glanced around, no guards nearby. Quickly, I stitched the photo back into the lining, but this time I added a thread of red beside it. A signal, a plea, look here. See them, I never knew whose photo it was. An officer's family, a previous prisoner who'd handled the coat. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd seen them, and in seeing them, I'd refused to let their image vanish into the machine of war. The days blurred. We worked, we whispered, we remembered. And then came the snow, not the suspended snow of our arrival, but a thick, relentless fall that muffled sound and turned the camp into a monochrome wasteland. Footprints vanished within hours. Breath froze on eyelashes. Even the guards seemed subdued, hunched in their greatcoats, eyes downcast. But in the barracks, we huddled closer, shared body heat, past warm stones wrapped in cloth, and stitched because stitching was warmth. Stitching was breath. Stitching was saying, I am still here, and so are they. One evening, Miri pressed a small bundle into my hands. For when you leave, she said. I didn't argue. We never spoke of survival as certainty, but as a quiet pact between us. What is it? I asked. Your ledger, she said. I copied it, and added more names. Then I sewed it into this. She held up a child's mitten, grey wool lined with soft flannel. No one will search a mitten. And if they do, well, it's just a mitten. I hugged her fiercely, feeling her bones beneath thin fabric, her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. Thank you, I whispered. For what? For remembering with me. She smiled, a real smile, small but bright. Always. The next week the transport stopped entirely. No lists, no dawn marches, just silence. And a strange, suffocating tension in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Rumors flew faster now. The front was 50 kilometers away, maybe 30. Officers burned more papers. Some guards vanished overnight. One morning, we found a storeroom unlocked, rifles stacked neatly, but no one to guard them. Nothing changed officially. But everything had. We kept working, though half the machines sat idle. The remaining officers demanded their uniforms pressed, polished, perfect, as if appearances could hold back the tide. I stitched their medals onto their chests with hands that no longer shook. Let them wear their pride. Let them polish their lies. We knew the truth, and our truth was already traveling, thread by thread, into the world. Then one freezing dawn the alarm didn't sound. No klaxon, no shouted orders. Just an eerie quiet, broken only by the wind and the distant rumble of engines. Different engines. Not the camp's trucks. Deeper, heavier. We gathered at the windows, silent, breath fogging the glass. In the distance, down the main road, a line of vehicles approached. Not black, not grey. Olive green. Miri gripped my arm. Is it? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Hope was too dangerous to name. But when the first soldier stepped through the gate, face young, eyes wide with horror, I knew. They came slowly, as if afraid the ground might collapse beneath them. They didn't shout, didn't order, just looked at us, at the barracks, at the chimneys that hadn't smoked in weeks. One of them saw me standing in the doorway, needle still in hand. He stopped, took off his helmet, and bowed his head. I didn't cry, not then, not until later, when I sat on my bunk and held the mitten Miri had given me, feeling the tiny ridges of stitched names beneath the wool. But even in that moment of release, I knew my work wasn't over, because freedom wasn't the end of memory. It was its beginning, and I would carry them, all of them, with me, in every step, in every breath, in every stitch I'd ever made. The war wasn't over, not really, but the silence at last had broken, and somewhere in a coat in Berlin, in a mitten in my hands, in a photograph hidden in wool, the world was beginning to listen. They called it liberation, a word too clean, too bright for what came after. Freedom didn't arrive with fanfare or music. It crept in on mud-caked boots and exhausted faces, carrying canteens and questions and eyes that couldn't quite meet ours without flinching. The soldiers didn't know what to do with us. Beat us, yes, clothe us. They tried, but how do you hold a soul that's been folded so many times it barely fits in its own skin? I remember the first meal they gave me, thin broth, a sliver of bread so soft it crumbled at the touch. I held it like a relic, ate it slowly, savoring each crumb, terrified that if I swallowed too fast, my body wouldn't believe it was real. Around me, women wept, not from joy, but from the unbearable weight of relief. As if letting go of fear might unravel them completely, Miri and I stayed together. We had no family left to find, no addresses to return to, just each other and the mittens sewn with names. We moved through the days like ghosts learning to walk again, legs stiff, voices unused, eyes too wide for the open sky. The camp emptied slowly. Some left on foot, others on trucks. A few never left at all, too broken to rise from their bunks. We buried them quietly, marking the earth with stones and whispered psalms. Even in freedom, we carried the rhythm of ritual. They took us to a displaced persons camp near Munich. Barracks again, but this time with windows that opened, with thin mattresses, with soap that smelled of lavender. Real lavender, not the ghost of it we'd imagined. Still, I slept with one hand under my pillow, fingers curled around the mitten. Just in case. One afternoon, while sorting donated clothes, a strange reversal, I found a child's coat lined with blue wool. My breath caught. Without thinking, I turned it inside out, ran my fingers along the seams. No red thread, no hidden name, just a coat. But for a moment I'd hoped. That was the strange thing about survival. Hope didn't vanish with the bars. It grew quieter, more complicated, laced with grief and guilt and a terrible tender longing. Miri started teaching again. Not sewing, she couldn't bear thread and needle just yet, but reading. She gathered orphaned children under a tarp in the courtyard and taught them letters in Yiddish, Hebrew, even a little German. So they remember who they are, she said, not just what was done to them. I watched her one evening, bathed in golden light, pointing to words on a scrap of newspaper. A boy, no older than Daniel had been, leaned into her side, tracing letters with a stubby finger. And I felt it again, that ache of love so fierce it threatened to split me open. I began writing, not in secret this time, not on scraps hidden beneath floorboards, but in a proper notebook, given to me by a Swedish aid worker with kind eyes and careful hands. I wrote down everything, every name, every story, every stitch I'd ever made. At first my hand shook, the ink bled through the paper. But I kept going. Because if I didn't, who would? One day I wrote Daniel's name at the top of a fresh page, then stopped. Stared at it for so long the letters blurred. I didn't know if he'd lived, didn't know if he'd breathed the same air as me on the day the gates opened. But I wrote anyway. Daniel Weiss, my brother, loved the way sunlight hit the chessboard, hummed when he concentrated. Last seen January 1944, Block 14, Auschwitz. I sent the letter to the Red Cross. Then another. And another, not because I expected an answer, but because silence felt like another kind of death. Weeks passed, then months. Spring came again, real spring, with crocuses pushing through the mud and birds arguing in the trees. Life insisting despite everything. One morning a telegram arrived. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I unfolded it. Miri stood beside me, silent, holding my elbow like an anchor. The words were few. Daniel Weiss, confirmed survivor, Dachau, recovering in hospital. Geneva. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat very still, feeling the world tilt and right itself over and over. Daniel, alive, breathing, somewhere under the same sky. We left for Geneva 3 days later. Took a train packed with others chasing ghosts or miracles. I held the mitten in my lap the whole way, fingers tracing the stitched names like rosary beads. The hospital was clean, quiet, too bright. And there, in a narrow bed by the window, sat Daniel, thinner, paler, but his eyes were the same. That sharp, curious gaze that had watched me so as a boy, asking, "How do you make it perfect, Clara?" He saw me in the doorway and froze. Then slowly he smiled. A real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. I walked to him, dropped to my knees beside the bed, and pressed my forehead to his hand. No words. None were big enough. Later, when he could speak without coughing, he told me fragments of cold, of hunger, of a man who shared his bread in the last winter, of nights spent whispering our mother's lullabies to stay awake. And then, quietly, I kept your name in my pocket, sewn into the lining of my coat, just like you taught me. I looked at him, stunned. You remembered? I remembered everything. In that moment I understood. The stitches had worked both ways, not just carrying our dead into the world, but holding our living together across the void. We stayed in Geneva through summer. Daniel grew stronger. I read to him from my notebook. He listened, eyes closed, tears slipping down his temples into the pillow. Keep writing, he said one evening. For them. For us. And I did. Years later, in a small flat in London, with a sewing machine by the window and shelves full of notebooks, I still do. I teach embroidery to children of survivors. They come shy, hesitant, fingers clumsy with thread. I show them the double seam, the hidden pocket, the loose knot that lets truth slip through. Why do we stitch it this way? And the girl asked me last week, freckled and fierce, her grandmother a seamstress in Bergen-Belsen. I smiled. Because some things must be carried close to the heart, and some truths are too precious to leave on the surface. She nodded, serious, and began her first seam every morning. I opened my ledger, now bound in leather, the pages yellowed, and add a name if I learn one, a detail if I remember it. And sometimes when the light is just right, I take out the mitten Miri gave me. The wool is frayed now, the stitches soft with time. But the names are still there, faint but legible. Like stars on a cloudy night, Miri passed 2 winters ago. She lived to see her students marry, have children, build lives from the fragments we saved. At her funeral, I placed a single spool of red thread in her hands. So you never lose the way back, I whispered. I never remarried, never had children of my own. But I have hundreds in my ledger, thousands in my memory. They live in every coat I mend, every seam I press, every story I tell. People ask me how I survived. I never give the full answer. Because survival wasn't just breath. It was resistance. It was love stitched into silence. It was choosing every day to bear witness, even when the world wasn't listening. But now, sometimes it is. A museum in Berlin once contacted me. They'd found a collection of SS uniforms in an attic. In the lining of one, they discovered a name, Esther, Minsk, 1927, and beside it a single thread of blue. They asked if I knew her. I wrote back, yes, she mattered, that's all I said, because in the end, that's all any of us ever needed, to be seen, to be remembered, to know that someone somewhere held our name gently in their hands and refused to let it disappear. I still sew, not for officers, not for survival, but for remembrance. And every stitch I make, every quiet, careful, deliberate stitch says the same thing over and over into the fabric of time. We were here. We loved, we resisted, we remembered, and so as long as I breathe will I.